building strategies, mega projects really feature very prominently. And in fact, they make up about 8% of global GDP at this point in time. Although they're usually identifiable by their scale and by their complexity, as well as by their costs, and in fact, for membership to this very exclusive club, you must cost over $1 billion to qualify, they should perhaps more appropriately be considered based on the degree of impact that they're going to have on a city, its competitiveness, and life in that city over time for the community. Bold, disruptive, and expensive mega projects are often quite controversial, and usually they attract very negative media, at least for some period of time, because they've run over budget, over cost, or they haven't delivered the commercial return that was anticipated, at least in the short term. But what's really critical when we discuss this is thinking about their contribution to the long-term prosperity, competitiveness, and livability, as well as the resilience of the cities in which they are hosted. Because well conceived and successfully implemented, they can transform our urban landscape radically and rapidly, positively reshaping the economic, the social, the cultural, and the natural flows of that city, as well as repositioning its identity and reputation on a world stage. So in the new urban geography, where confidence equates to the attraction of talent as well as capital, mega projects really matter. So we're incredibly lucky today to be joined by this set of panelists, each of whom has a unique perspective to add to the conversation, and who collectively, I believe, control about $13 billion worth of mega projects just in Brisbane by itself. So we do have to take extremely good care of them. So joining Malcolm on the sofa, please let me introduce you to Graeme Newton, head of the Cross River Rail Authority. And I believe you were not only a QUT Outstanding Alumni, but also the recipient of a planning award for a non-planner. Yes. So that's really a pretty significant thing. Simon Crooks, Project Director of Queen's Wharf from the Destination Brisbane Consortium. You must be the master of the understatement, because I believe you did once describe your project as not small, and yourself as an old site guy. So not too bad for an old site guy with a small project. And then Desiree Houston-Jones, the Executive Director for Planning Services at EDQ, one of the drivers of the 304-hectare urban renewal precinct, at Hamilton North Shore, one of the largest in the state. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give them some encouragement for the hard time they're going to get. Now, I've been wanting to meet you, Graeme, for a very long time, because it's a quite well-known fact that there's nothing I love in the world, apart from my dog, more than a good railway and a good railway story. So obviously, a key benchmark for any world city is, especially one that's seeking to claim a role as a new world city in a different economic paradigm, is the absolute imperative of a high-quality turn-up-and-ride transport system. So it's probably not surprising that the roughly $5.4 billion project that you are in command of is described as the government's #1 infrastructure project. Good for the government. Now, what I'm interested in discussing here is this actually a transport project, or are we talking about something much more fundamental, unlocking the economic prosperity of the city and making our urban fabric work harder? This is the moment to state your claim.
Look, the answer is to that is yes, both. So it is obviously a transport project. I mean, Queensland, southeast Queensland is going to have this population growth over the next 20 so years. We're going to have roughly the population of Adelaide moving into this region. They're mainly going to be moving into those outer suburb areas, into the more sort of broader regional areas outside of Brisbane. There will be population growth in Brisbane, but the greater growth will be in that outer area. But we're also seeing the Treasury statistics are telling us that there's going to be growth in employment in that sort of inner core. And it's good to have this conversation after Malcolm's presentation, because it's not just the CBD, it's actually that sort of core area. And the challenge is to be able to move that sort of 83% of population growth around southeast, but then also get those people who are working in that inner core to be able to get there quite comfortably. So I guess the aim is to be able to move them, set up a situation where that they can get themselves onto public transport, because that's the best mode of transport to get there, not sitting in a car park on the M1 and catching the train or catching the Brisbane Metro into those places of employment, and then where those commercial operations are. So if there's tradesmen moving across the grid or whatever, they can move more freely because they're not being clogged up by congestion of commuters. So to come to the second part of the question is, well, is this part of that activation? Well, it's about allowing Southeast Queensland to become this sort of prosperous region, not just the sort of centre core of Brisbane, but also using the stimulation of this investment around those station precincts. So Malcolm eloquently described the Roma Street precinct that probably needs a little bit of work. And Woolloongabba is an area that just really hasn't been activated, and putting a railway station in the middle of there is going to be a massive contributor to that growth of that particular area and the infill of both commercial, residential, businesses, restaurants, those sorts of things. And then Bogger Road in its own right is actually gathering momentum. So it's the crossover between allowing people to live where they want to live in an affordable environment, be able to move freely across the region, and then you have the inefficiencies taken out of that, change the way in which people get to and from work, and then allow them to be able to freely move to those entertainment points or those employment nodes that they want to get to in an unencumbered way. So that's what it's all about.
So I'm going to push you just a little bit harder because I can, and because you seem pretty
yes.
robust, so let's go for it. How do we make sure that what we put out to the market is not about a tunnelling project with some stations with fancy architecture wrapped around an engineering solution? So how do you actually make sure that the triple bang for buck, if you like, is actually realised and that we're setting those projects up to be everything they can be?
Well, I'm glad you asked. We're actually out to tender at the moment. So the expression of interest phase is well advanced, and yesterday we actually issued the expression of interest documentations. We had a registration and now the expression of interest, and we had a really strong response to that. And there's two elements to the project. This is from the engineering side of things as far as the delivery. How you package it up, how you define the scope of the work that you want done, that's what that's all about. But we're also looking at those associated activities, so the around station development, the activation. We're writing that into some elements of the scope, and then other elements we're preserving, which will be part of another process to put out to the market. So in a roundabout way, it's how you are clear about the purpose that you're looking to try and achieve, clear about the intent and the purpose of the infrastructure itself. It does need to satisfy those minimum requirements. We don't want a tunnel that leaks. We don't want trains that miss the station because of poor signalling setup. So it's got to actually serve its purpose. But to achieve that broader outcome, that's part of the way in which we scope it into the market, the way we scope the contract definition, and the way we actually try and appeal to the right market for the right job. So the technical engineering tunnelling people are more interested in that component as opposed to developers who are interested in the bit that is actually around those station precincts. So it's how you package it up.
Great job. I'm very envious. I might just flick to you actually for a follow-up, Desiree, if that's okay. So I believe that in 2015, the Australian infrastructure audit suggested that the greatest contribution that can be made to regional economic competitiveness and growth is a great transport system, and projected at the same time that the cost to our metropolitan areas by 2030 of having a suboptimal transport system in congestion terms could be about $30 billion in productivity every year, which is clearly an enormous amount of money. We often make these conversations about Brisbane. We're sitting in Brisbane, the inner 5K of Brisbane, the stations you're describing are in Brisbane. How important is this piece of infrastructure or this kind of mega project to the rest of the South East Queensland region?
I think Graeme's obviously nailed it in saying that for the region, it takes our ability to move around the region for all purposes to a whole nother level. And so it sort of doesn't just increase the pie, it actually creates a whole nother pie. And I actually liken it a little bit to, the connections in your brain. The more connections that it has, the more productive that you are. The less connections, it's not so good. So it's obviously critical in those kind of conceptual ways. And then, as Graeme was also mentioning, EDQ's done a lot of work with Cross River Rail Authority on looking at what those catalyst sites can do for ensuring that you do get the biggest bang in every respect for the buck for Cross River Rail, and also in looking at what other efficiencies can be gained from the transport system that's going to, again, improve the return on that investment. And there are well over 100 underutilised government sites in that corridor. And the ones that we hear of the most, obviously, the biggest ones within the 3Ks of the CBD, and careful thought and a whole lot of input from private sector as well goes into how we're going to get the most out of those sites. If you combine the connectivity that Cross River Rail gives to the region by increasing the capacity for the cities that are in the region and these emerging hubs, then private sector are going to be very interested in that in terms of confidence and also investment. And to flip the coin, it was mentioned earlier that San Francisco are trying to make real inroads in their integrated transport solutions, but they're actually not at the moment such a flash example, because they are really hamstrung by a lack of good rail infrastructure, and good rail infrastructure means high frequency and reliable and high capacity, and it's a key part of that integrated solution. And so what's happening in San Francisco is it's really to work and live to work and study or do business in San Francisco, you really have to live in San Francisco, or you spend a whole lot of time in your car getting into San Francisco, which is costing people, motorists, $2,000 a year in extra fuel costs sitting in traffic, and a great loss to the city of billions of dollars in productivity. And more than that, San Francisco is now the most expensive place to rent or buy property above New York and London. So I think that's the result of not having an integrated transport system. Clearly there's great advantage to us going forward in taking the region forward over the next many years.
And whilst I give Malcolm a chance to catch his breath, we might turn to you, Simon. We've not met before, and you've got a huge chunk of the city that you're currently looking after. And obviously these kind of mega projects, they don't just reframe our position, they also reposition our identity, and they inspire global confidence. But there's a delicate balance between making this all about what drives destinational appeal for visitors. Even if we're going to want them for the fare box, we still need to really be true to making sure that projects like yours appeal to local people and are true to our emerging identity as a young New World city. How do you think you're tackling that on a project that is such a significant part of our CBD and river access?
It's an interesting comment. I think one feeds the other. So every time I've been involved in tourism discussions, you look at all the analytics on that, and tourists come to areas to see what the locals do. So if the metrics that we're looking at, sort of 1.39 million extra visitors per annum and that sort of stuff. But what we actually have to do to make that work is focus on what the locals want. So a major focus for us in what's basically 10% of the CBD and sort of a kilometre of riverfront is creating something that's live and an entertainment experience and active in the evenings in an area of the city that is quite quiet, because there's been a government precinct historically, that Brisbaneites and Southeast Queenslanders will go to. If we get that right, and that's our focus, then the tourists will come to that, because it will be a live, entertaining precinct. And if you look at, people always talk about sort of 20 years ago when Crown redeveloped South Bank in Melbourne. Crown, if you say you go to Crown now, you go to the entertainment precinct, you don't go to a casino. It's actually that whole entertainment strip along there. And that's really, Melbourneites use it, and we've got to do the same here in Brisbane. And it's got to be complementary to South Bank. So the bridge is very important to us, but we're not trying to compete with South Bank. We're actually trying to produce an offering so people will move along and across. The issues about connectivity on the river are interesting. I've spent some time with Luke Fraser, who's doing Howard Smith Wharfs. And then you look at the guys from Dexus who are developing in Eagle Street. And then you look at Brisbane Live, if Harvey Lister gets that up. That connectivity of entertainment for Brisbane, which luckily enough Queen's Wharf is sort of in the middle of, is what we're all focused on. We're not competing, we're actually trying to be complementary and draw and feed off each other. The river discussion's interesting. I know what the council's doing in terms of sort of the taxis and helipads and all this sort of thing that you've seen going along. I think it's all good because it draws people to a good access for between them all. To Graeme's point, I actually made a comment to him beforehand. I'd quite like the old scheme where we had a station right in the integrated resort. But I've just been in Hong Kong with a joint venture meeting. We love what's happening with the tunnel, and we also love what's happening with Brisbane Metro. We see the connectivity and drawing people and ease of access into Queen's Wharf and around the city as being really important to us. And I'll say again, it's for Brisbaneites first. If we get that right and we get it attractive enough so people will want to go to the sky deck 24 hours a day whenever they need to be and activate and actively and positively activate the foreshore, then the tourists will come.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's very easy for us to get hung up on the debate about it is about gambling, it's about a casino. In fact, it's about public realm, public space.
It is. I haven't really bought into that debate too much because it's not something that I'm focused on directly. But the stats are 5% of the GFA is gaming. The joint venture, when we actually bid and lifted the gaming floors 2 levels above George Street. So you can flow through the precinct at multiple levels through the retail, through the 50 food and beverage offerings and everything else, and never see a casino. That doesn't happen anywhere else in Macau, Australia, or in Las Vegas. The idea is not to trap you into that. If people want to go there, they can. This is an entertainment precinct. So the focus for us, and I remember having this discussion with you, Malcolm, is about 12 metres of vertical transition from George Street down to the river, is how we enable people to flow through that. And most importantly, there's 9 heritage buildings in there that most of us have probably never used. And my job and our job is to make sure that you'll want to use them.
So let's just pick up on this and obviously we didn't give Malcolm a hard time beforehand, we let him do his thing, and now we've sat him down, lulled him into a full sense of security, and we're going to hammer him. So the important thing here is that we've got all of these mega projects represented by your colleagues. How do we make sure that the Brisbane we get isn't just the net sum gain of your mega project, and your mega project? How do we make sure that there is a unifying vision or identity, future identity for this city, the one that we want it to be, and that they're all contributing to it? How do we drive that debate fearlessly? That's you.
You want me? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I think we have to have a non-political debate about it. It's an urban problem, not a political problem. And I think we often forget that individual positions that are often taken appear to be urban arguments, but in fact are not. If you go back 1925, Queensland dissolved the upper house and the parliament, and at about the same time we amalgamated the councils, the inner city councils, to make one big council, which is still the model that every other Australian city would like to have. But that's 90 years ago. And my point now is that necessarily still the best model? Do we need to take that further now in terms of the vision that you're talking about, how we integrate all these particular initiatives? They can't be standalone, they must have a vision, they must all work together. And I think that's really very much part of what I think the role of my office is to try and get that conversation at the urban level, the outcome, the vision level, not around individual issues of how it's done, but really have that conversation. The one example I would give is the Goodwill Bridge, which I think when it was put up had a very low quality of debate about what was bleedingly obvious for that site that it would work, and yet the debate was very much about money and was it needed, and they were not very sophisticated observations. It was needed, it's a phenomenal success, we need another 10 of them kind of argument. And then I think you can take that debate and give it an economic overlay, you can give it an urban overlay, you can give it a city health overlay. There's lots in this space. We haven't begun yet.
But are we bold enough? I mean, I think a comment was made earlier that we're lazy. We're a lazy city, great climate, beautiful river, lovely mountains, great people, Bougainvillea walk. Are we actually a lazy city? Do we need to be just so much more assertive with our expression of identity and self?
I think we do need to be bolder, yes.
Obviously didn't want to be drawn on that any further. So how about we just move on a little bit to another very important facet of mega projects, which is, do you think the community writ large, mass generalisation, these guys, are they too quick with their snap judgments? Do we engage them effectively, or do they see something in the Courier Mail or on social media, make a snap judgment about whether it's good or bad, don't engage properly in the debate, and then we have these really strong surges of sentiment that don't necessarily really understand the argument properly? How do we take a community on a journey around these mega projects?
I'll have a crack at that. But I think that the thing is there needs to be an understanding of what is the problem that you're actually investing the money into, and you need to have a very clearly articulated intent as to what is the problem you're solving. So in the case of the engineering solution or the public transport solution that we're dealing with, I mean, the reality is that at peak time there's a capacity of 24 trains per hour across the bridge, and we're up to 21. Very, very sort of simple maths. It doesn't take much of a logical leap to realise that we're actually starting to reach capacity. So that's the clear problem articulation. But really, people then go, okay, well, how do you solve that problem? And bringing people into that conversation is an important thing to do. It can get undermined by sort of cheap, snappy sort of responses. Well, if you shouldn't be spending that money there, you should be spending it here, and then you end up with sort of polarisation. And of course, media love a degree of conflict and so forth. I'm not blaming media; it's just that's the sport that they're in. But then I think once the problem is articulated and you say we're making a decision to move on, but give it that aspirational direction of where you're going to. If we're going to do this and solve this problem, we also want to achieve these other outcomes that are part of that aspirational challenge that we're looking to do. So back to what we were talking about, the broader regional benefits that actually come out of this. They're not sort of bolt-on and convenient things. It's actually part of, well, why do we need to have a more free-flowing? You want to be able to turn up to your railway station and not know the timetable. You want to just turn up and a train comes within 7 minutes and you go in. So then it becomes a better choice as to why you wouldn't get in your car and drive because it's just too inconvenient and you've got to pay parking at the other end. So then it comes to the individual. But then the other aspect too is those wider economic benefits as to if we're making this investment, then that just unlocks a whole lot of other broader benefits. So there's various phases to it. You've got to have a very clearly defined problem that you're solving, understand the context of what that sort of broader issue is, but then also say, but that the flow-on effects, the benefits are actually going to be greater if you come with us on this journey. So it's not a simple task because people have their own mind.
And by the way, I like my trains within 4 minutes,
4
so
minutes,
I definitely
right.
won't wait
Okay.
7. Desiree, we might come back to you. So just thinking in the context of Hamilton North Shore, how do we make sure that when we both conceptualise our message, these large projects, that we're doing it in a way that communicates both the economic argument, which seems to be the one that people focus around because money is easy to identify and talk about. How do we make it one of livability and choice? How do we have that conversation?
I'll just pick up on something that was said earlier, actually, on that front, which is that if at the moment a lot of people are understanding that or seeing most value in translating things to money, then there's actually a whole lot of work that's been done around, and Malcolm's talked to this as well, about the money that is saved by having a city that generates well and healthy inhabitants. So, there are ways to translate those things. But in terms of balance, I think you can only look at balance if you first have a clear idea of what the context is. So, to state the obvious, if the context is statewide or worldwide in terms of destination from Simon's point of view, then that's the context, and then regionally, again from Simon's point of view, but also for North Shore and any other regionally significant project, then that's the context, but it could be the local street. So whatever the context and time is another part of that equation. And those tensions between those competing issues are across any sort of regulatory authority, as we are for part of our role. But for Hamilton North Shore, so looking at, as using the example, looking at the context, it's at the gateway to the greater Brisbane CBD. It's a large renewal opportunity site on the Brisbane River. It's close to enterprise and employment, it's got good services, and it's close to some key transport routes. And the state government actually own a fair part of that land. So then considering those, and sorry to also highlight, you know, if there's frontage to the Brisbane River, obviously accessibility and the experience of the Brisbane River is of great value, as it should be, to everybody in South East Queensland. And so how do you take all of those things together and balance them? Well, you know, of course there has to be some economic return, but then what else is bigger that you can get out of this site? And so, you know, we look at that, and, you know, the development scheme for Hamilton North Shore is now 8 years old. And so, you know, it's, well, the outcomes that we'd be looking to see there, or looking for, are, you know, increased accessibility to the river and open space, given its river frontage, recognising that it does have the potential to be a regional destination, improved connectivity, and, you know, looking at Malcolm's bridges, but improved connectivity into the integrated transport network that we're all talking about, generating greater employment and smart, integrated, coordinated community facilities. And so, you know, balancing all of those things, added to the fact that the state actually own part of it, so they can maybe take the more time to look really comprehensively and be a bit bolder in thinking about some of the outcomes. All of those pieces come into the picture, and we're also, you know, currently informed by some really and watching some great success with Eat Street markets, because it's an interim use. It started with a fantastic idea of a couple of people. It's now evolved to the next generation, where it's moved down the river a little bit. It's been, you know, it's been zhuzhed up a bit, but still has all its original appeal, and a bit more car parking actually. But it now has 19,000 people visiting it each weekend. Over 50% of those are outside of Brisbane, Brisbane City Council area. And it's increased the patronage of from the City Cat, North Shore, Hamilton City Cat by 400%. So, you know, there's regional significance there to be had. And so, you know, balancing all those things is you know.
So we might just pick up on two, I'm conscious that we've got very little time, and two other questions I definitely wanted to ask you, and I'll pick up on your point about balance. So many of the people in the audience may work in the development sector, and another element of balance that we don't often get a chance to talk about quite so publicly is money in the envelope on day one versus a better public return on investment or net public benefit over time. So we ask developers to do all of this and a kick-ass public realm, and then we expect them to put a lot of money in the envelope for the privilege of doing so. You know, how do we make that balance better, particularly when we're transacting on state land, do you think, between the immediate return to Exchequer versus the long-term return to the public?
I can partially answer that from sort of the joint ventures viewpoint. It's time. So that, I mean, we, a bit like Hammersmith Wharfs, we have a 99-year lease on the land. So the joint venture discussions around what we invest now, there's some very clear guidelines during the bid process about what we should and shouldn't do in terms of public realm, and we have and are living up to that. But actually, if you look at it from a commercial viewpoint, we have to make sure that the precinct returns to the joint venture and the $3 billion plus that they're putting in. That's not a short-term decision. A lot of the discussions we're having is make sure we invest in the right way to have the flexibility for the future. So you don't take short-term financial decisions around your public infrastructure or anything else, because you're going to be responsible for them for the longer term as well. So we're responsible for all the in-ground services, we're responsible for everything. So our decisions are a lot longer term. The other drivers around that, I mean, Green Star and things like that, they're well-known and well-used levers. And you actually see that if you take a longer-term view, and the deal is structured in a longer-term way, when the state give you the opportunity for that land, then the developers will respond.
So have we got to be more open in having that dialogue?
Yes. I mean, these discussions at any level are about risk transfers. We don't, certainly from the IRR in terms of what the payback is, we don't worry about 99 years, but we do look at 20 years. And the discussions around that have to be open and clear about expectations. But if you're asking somebody to take financial risk, then they need to understand exactly what their opportunity is to defray that longer term. And there always are. It's just about being clear about it and setting the right governance guidelines. And I mean, EDQ do that well with us. And we have, in my view, a good, robust process that we're going through. It started well in the bid with a different government. Both governments, and the comments, I think, in a previous discussion about sort of political, I think you made the comment, Malcolm, about taking the politics out of it. That's certainly the case for our project. And clarity is the point, I suppose.
Did you want to add to that, Graeme?
Well, I think the point around risk allocation is a good one. I mean, there's a lot of talk around risk transfer, and it's a misdescribed. It's really about the right risk allocation. So there's retained risk that a government as a client should retain. There's risk that can be transferred to a very competent deliverer. So whether it's in your precinct or in our case it's in a tunnel circumstance where you've got engineers and constructors who are very, very good at this stuff. That's not the sort of risk that you would hang on to as a state government, but you've got to put fair compensation for that risk that's being transferred. But there's other elements that you retain that you sort of go, well, it's not fair to pass that on. And there's been a swinging pendulum in the delivery of projects where governments have tried to sort of shift risk across, and that just drives the price up because the private sector will say, look, it's not a risk we're comfortable with. If you want to give it to us, well, we'll take it on, but there's going to be a premium attached to it. And that's where the courage and I guess the engagement from government, whether it's in a public realm sort of environment or integrated resort or an infrastructure project, it's being informed, being educated and being engaged around how you manage that and have that relationship in that contractual environment to get the right allocation of risk, to get the right outcome that the community needs.
Can I give you an example of that? In my past
Well, as long
life,
as you do it in 20 seconds.
ran a regional contractor in Queensland. So PPPs, the risk allocations are shifted quite heavily onto the delivery team. We added margin, and it was generally about 2 percentage points margin because it was a PPP. So that's never actually discussed, whereas more conventional managing contract delivery mechanism from a building viewpoint, a lot lower margin because the risk allocations were more equitable. So those discussions sometimes aren't had.
So to give you all one last word and to make sure that the guys at the back with the timing machine aren't having a heart attack, the question is, it's 2030, you've got 5 new stations, you've got an integrated resort, you've got 10 bridges, and you've got Hamilton North Shore. What is the world saying about Brisbane in one word, Graeme?
A fantastic city to visit, easy to get around, just love it.
That's 15 words, but nice. Simon?
Skydeck.
Skydeck.
World's most livable city.
Again, 6 words.
Yeah,
Yours
I
is the
think
last word.
A top destination for visiting.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, before you rush off to lunch, big hand for our panellists, Desiree, Malcolm, Simon and Graeme.